Welcome to the realm of science fiction, where imagination knows no bounds and extraordinary stories unfold. Enjoy the adventure.
The docking clamps released with a metallic hiss, and Julian Raye stepped onto Ae'laa, a cord station, a gleaming ring of alloy and glass, orbiting the gray silence of Velari 9. The gravity was artificial. The air filtered to sterile neutrality. But the tension, that was real, palpable, almost sentient. The corridor welcomed him not with ceremony, but with surveillance. Dozens of eyes, some flesh, some chrome watched from the shadows of embassy alcoves and retinal scanners. Humanity's flag, though technically permitted here, was hung lower than the rest. A gesture, subtle, intentional. He moved forward under a ceiling of fractal crystal lattice, reflecting light in fragmented spectrums designed to calm volatile species. The architects had accounted for species prone to panic, rage, telepathic. Bleed, but no design could account for fear. Rooted in history, Julian was a diplomat, but he wasn't here to shake hands. He was here because humans were unpredictable, and the other races feared that most of all. At the station's heart, a column of liquid memory pulsed in the diplomatic chamber, a Velari construct known to store ambient emotional residue. He stopped to watch it shift and felt the faint thrum of judgment. Not malice, caution. A test dot behind that wall of engineered calm. Wars had nearly reignited with the breath of a mistranslation. This place was built to prevent extinction by arrogance. Julian took a deep breath. Not of the air, but of the moment. No. One trusted the humans. Not yet. And that, he understood. They feared what humanity might become. What no one considered was what humanity might awaken. He adjusted his collar, stepped through the final threshold, and entered the station that had held back galactic war for 27 years, until now. They stood like statues carved from living quartztal, translucent, with luminous veins that pulsed to the rhythm of thought, not blood. The Velari were ancient, elegant, and wholly alien. Their eyes shimmered without pupils, their expressions unreadable, yet each movement conveyed an unspoken gravity. Where humans gestured, they emanated. No sound passed between them, unless ritual demanded it. Communication flowed through harmonized biofields, subtle shifts in color, in resonance. A single word in their tongue was less a sound than a vibration of identity. When they did speak, it was slow, deliberate, crystalline in tone, ceremonial fragments of meaning, too fragile for casual use. Touch among them was sacred, not taboo sacrilege. Their nervous systems, evolved for isolated psychic absorption, reacted violently to physical contact. Unbonded skin-to-skin exposure could trigger synaptic dissonance, madness, even death. They lived apart even when together, their intimacy buried deep beneath ritual and memory-binding rites. To outsiders, they were cold. But the truth was more complex. They didn't fear emotion. They feared unleashing it. And in that silence, that crystalline poise was a quiet warning. Their beauty was not a weakness. It was a seal. And once broken, not even the Velari knew what might emerge from within. His hand hovered above the datapad longer than it should have. A flick of the screen would call up the official report. He already knew every word. 17. Dead. 3 species involved. One human assumption made too quickly, translated too literally. It hadn't been an attack. It had been a gift, and they had answered it with guns. Julian didn't blame the ones who pulled the triggers. Not entirely. The protocols had been ambiguous, the context unclear. But it was his job to read the spaces between cultures, to translate silence, to detect what wasn't said. He had failed. They had paid. He moved differently now, slower, cleaner. Every word measured, every breath counted. But beneath the surface, the same fire burned. Curiosity, wonder, the unrelenting need to understand what others feared to ask. That was the danger of humans, not their aggression, not their ambition. It was their refusal to stop reaching out. The diplomats on this station wore their fear like armor. Julian wore his guilt like a scar. He wasn't here to redeem the past. Redemption wasn't real, but understanding? That was still worth bleeding for. And if another line blurred between contact and catastrophe, he would step across it again. She had studied the silence since childhood, learned to speak in frequencies, to feel in regulated pulses, to let thoughts pass through her like filtered light. The elders called it harmony. The others called it duty. Ae'laa called it hollow. They said emotion was meant to pass, not pool. That holding a feeling too long could warp the field. But lately, She felt something stirring, something unclean by their standards, yet undeniably alive. Her resonance faltered in council sessions. Her harmonics drifted off-tempo. And when the human entered the station, she felt something she didn't have a word for. It wasn't fear. It wasn't repulsion. It was gravity. His presence bent her senses. His emotional field wasn't sealed like the others. It flickered, cracked, leaked meaning. It bled heat. He smiled too easily. He looked through things. And when he spoke, the sound wrapped around her like warmth. She should have withdrawn, realigned, reported the anomaly to her mentor. She didn't. Instead, she listened for his voice in the crowd, held her breath when his thoughts brushed hers like mist across crystal. And though she said nothing, her resonance shimmered with forbidden's curiosity. Ae'laa was not broken, but something inside her was beginning to move. The first words between them were measured, like engineers testing a bridge before crossing it. She inquired about his neural latency metrics. He responded with a touch of humor, threading warmth into the sterile language of data. She didn't laugh. Velari didn't, but her voice paused, half a heartbeat longer than protocol allowed. He noticed. Her phrasing was textbook, yet her intonation bent at the edges. A subtle rise, a lilt where there shouldn't be one. He tracked. Her cadence the way he'd been trained to read alien pitch shifts, except this wasn't training anymore. This was something else. Organic, reflexive. He answered with ease, masking the sudden tightness in his chest. The air between them wasn't charged, exactly. It was tuned like two frequencies caught in a delicate harmonic. He couldn't name it, but he felt it. So did she. Her emotional field, normally seamless, pulsed with irregular energy. She adjusted her stance, realigned her breathing. A recalibration. She'd broken rhythm, and she knew it. He asked a simple follow-up standard. Safe. But her reply came half a second too late, as if she were untangling herself from something invisible. Neither said a word about it. And yet, when they parted, they each looked back, not at each other, but at the space where they had stood. That narrow gap, filled with unspoken frequencies and the first brush of a pattern, neither of them understood. Not yet. But something had moved, and neither of them would be able to stop it now. The guidance came not in anger, but in stillness. The kind that wrapped itself around a soul like cold vapor. The elders spoke in harmonized cadence, their crystalline forms dimmed to muted blue, a signal of restraint, not rage. They had seen the shift in her resonance, felt it ripple across. The collective network like a fault line beneath still waters. Her attunement to the human had not gone unnoticed. Humans burn without knowing they do, one said. Their emotions bleed without containment. They do not seal their thoughts. They do not soften their edges. You cannot touch fire and stay dry. Ae'laa stood in silence, her own luminescence flickering under the weight of ancestral judgment. They did not punish her. They offered caution, ritual, ancient and final. Distance is clarity. Clean fields do not breed collapse, but deep within her, something rebelled. Not with defiance, but with doubt. The fire they feared did not feel like destruction. It felt like light. And for the first time, she questioned whether staying untouched meant staying whole. They told her to stay unawakened, but the dream had already begun. And part of her, quiet and trembling, no longer wished to wake. Her fingers slid across her palm, careful, precise, ritualized. The motion was familiar, taut, hollow. No spark, no resonance, no echo. She repeated the gesture again, slower this time, watching the ripple of light trail down her crystalline wrist. Still nothing. It wasn't the act itself that failed. It was the absence, the missing presence. The human. She had touched him for less than a breath, yet the imprint remained like static behind her thoughts, warm, erratic, alive. The field between them had pulsed with something ancient, primal, forbiddens. And it hadn't hurt. It had awakened. That truth uncoiled within her now, hungry and quiet. She had not told the elders. She could not. Even naming it would shatter something sacred. But in the stillness of her private chamber, when memory curled around her bones like smoke, she closed her eyes and whispered into the dark. I want to feel it again. The first jolt hit like a swallowed thunderclap. Gravity surged, then buckled. Floors tilted 2 degrees left. Lights fractured into strobes of emergency red. Across the Ae'laa Accord station, protocols blinked into hesitation. Stabilizers lagged by half a second, enough to matter. Velari dignitaries gripped support beams, their resonance fields collapsing into self-protection mode. II voices stuttered over intercoms in every known language. Tethered cables snapped taut, dangling from the ceilings like neural threads cut mid-transmission. Julian staggered. His equilibrium gyroscopes caught the slip, but instinct had already taken over. Reflex bypassed protocol. His hand shot out, not for the railing, not for cover, but for her. Fingers met crystalline skin. For less than a breath, they connected, and the moment passed. Gravity recalibrated. Lights stabilized. The hum of the station normalized, but something deeper older had changed. Ae'laa stood still. Her body trembled at a frequency too fine for machines to read. Her pupils had dilated to geometric slivers. Her skin glowed wrong. Not with pain, not with fear. With something else. She didn't pull away. He did. Only after the emergency passed did he realize what he'd done. What couldn't be undone. Because the Velari did not touch. And now she had been touched. Not by accident. By humanity. Somewhere. Beneath them, deep in the station's crystalline network, an alert quietly logged the contact. Class Z resonance anomaly detected. Origin: human touch transfer unbonded. Risk factor: unquantifiable. The contact was brief, measured in seconds, if at all, but for Ae'laa, time lost structure. Her world fractured into pulses of color, memory, and sensation so overwhelming, her own name dissolved in the static. Her crystalline nerves surged with impossible light, refracting signals she had no genetic language for. Human emotional patterns, chaotic, unfiltered, alive, flooded her empathic lattice, crashing through bioethical barriers designed to prevent precisely this. Shame spiraled through the ancestral layers of her psyche. Her body was not built for this. Her mind shouldn't survive it. And yet, it did. The protocols taught that uncontrolled resonance was trauma, that disorder bred collapse. But what bloomed inside her wasn't collapse. It was clarity. She felt, not echoes, not simulations. Something vast and unbound had moved through her, and it hadn't shattered her. It had awakened her. The station steadied. The moment passed. But deep within her core, feedback loops continued spinning, replaying the moment in silence. Every nerve hummed in memory of the contact. A ripple passed through her skin. Like heat. She should have called for medical override. She should have gone to the elders. But instead, she stood still, afraid that if she moved, the feeling might fade, and she wasn't ready to let it go. The chamber was quiet, regulated, sterile, but her thoughts were not. Ae'laa lay still, limbs composed, face neutral, but her internal field trembled. Resonance. Protocols failed to mask the churn inside. Every pulse of breath was shadowed by memory, not of harm, but of something far more dangerous. Desire. Her skin burned. Not with pain, but imprint the neural echo of human contact still alive in her. Fibers. It had left a shape behind, like heat in the outline of a vanished flame. And no matter how she tried to suppress it, her field kept flickering, repeating the moment over and over, as if her biology itself refused to forget. There had been no violence in his touch, no dominance, just intent, warmth, reflex, humanity. That was what frightened her most, not the physicality of it, but the emotional charge behind it. It hadn't been sterile. It had meant something. She could not speak of it. To do so would trigger cleansing, reset, erasure. The elders would not tolerate emotional mutation. And yet, in that silence, a new instinct stirred small, electric, and hungry. She did not wish to be cured. That was the truth. She did not want it to stop. The difference was subtle at first. Ae'laa began arriving early. She lingered after debriefings. Her responses remained precise, but there was a softness at the edges, as though language had acquired texture. Julian logged it all: dilated pupils during non-stimulus intervals, increased proximity tolerance, inflection shifts, her field resonance, pulse just out of sync with the standard Velari patterns. Most wouldn't notice, but he wasn't most. He'd studied alien cognition for half his life. Emotional leaks, trauma adaptations, mimicry reflexes. And yet, this didn't feel like trauma. It felt like choice. She asked more questions, now curious ones. Why do humans speak even when alone? What does warmth feel like inside the chest? The kind of questions that signaled emotional cognition. Beyond protocol. Still, he hesitated to name it. Because naming it would make it real. He adjusted her status file quietly. Added a private tag. Anomalous empathic drift. Observe. Only. He told himself it was for her protection. But in the quiet moments between logs, He reviewed the station footage, not for errors, not for reports, for the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, and the way part of him, against all regulation, wanted to look back. She no longer pretended it was coincidence. Every placement was intentional. When Julian sat, she watched. When he stood, she followed. During calibrations, she positioned herself precisely one human arm's length away, not enough to violate protocol, but close enough to feel the gravity of presence. The memory of the touch hadn't faded. It had deepened, gained facets, like a crystal folding in on itself. It had become a resonance, not just in her skin, but in her bones. The imprint hummed in the places where her thoughts grew quiet. She began testing proximity, sitting where he had sat, touching datapads he had just used, a fork he'd rested on the edge of his plate. Each item carried a subtle charge, a leftover warmth that made her mind flutter with unnamed impulses. Velari doctrine warned of emotional addiction, but this wasn't obsession. It was ... alignment, a kind of internal harmonizing her species had never cataloged. The others did not notice, or pretended not to, but she did. She noticed everything, every shift in his voice, every glance he tried not to return. And every time she moved nearer, the echo grew louder, stronger, sharper. She didn't want contact, not yet, but the space between them had become a magnetic corridor, and she couldn't stop walking it. She had access to every human database, cultural logs, emotional lexicons, neural maps, but none of them satisfied. He did. Julian became her unspoken source text, his emotional field a dynamic, living model of what it meant to feel without filtration. She observed everything, the way he blinked when confused, the rise in voice pitch when passionate, the involuntary tensing of his hands when agitated, and when he was silent. She listened even more carefully. Her questions turned strange. What does it mean to ache without injury? Do you still feel someone after they leave? What does warmth feel like beneath your skin? They were not diagnostic questions, not anymore. They were personal. Julian responded gently, warily, each answer weighed before release. But he didn't stop her. He could have reported it, should have, but curiosity ran both ways, and some part of him needed to understand why she was asking. He noted it quietly, beneath the formal reports, in the margins of his thoughts. She wasn't just learning human behavior. She was internalizing it. The Velari viewed emotion as resonance, predictable, controlled, contained. But Ae'laa no longer echoed feelings. She chased them. And the human pulse, unbound and unmeasured, had become the frequency she couldn't stop tuning into. Her fields were never meant to shift. Velari resonance patterns were fixed, symmetrical, quiet, mathematically perfect. But hers had started. Drifting. It began with minor delays, feedback loops, where there should have been silence. Then, anticipation. She reacted to emotions before they were expressed, reaching into the emotional field seconds before it pulsed. Her mentors might have called it intuition, but it wasn't. It was expansion. Her mind was changing. The neural grid that once limited perception was unfolding like a map too long kept shut. She felt new channels forming, illegible and non-linear. She couldn't describe them in Velari terms, but she could feel them. And worse, she could like them. Julian saw it too. During his private evaluations, he recorded her patterns. Each scan came back irregular. Her emotional field didn't mirror Velari or human. It combined them, a hybrid waveform. Biologically impossible, yet undeniable. He should have flagged it, raised alerts, logged a medical concern. Instead, he watched. Not because he was negligent, but because awe had rooted him in place. He wasn't witnessing a malfunction. He was witnessing an evolution. She was becoming something that didn't exist in any species. Registry. And neither of them knew how far it would go. The Velari did not exile in punishment. They did it in silence. If discovered, there would be no trial, no confrontation, no negotiation. Ae'laa's name would vanish from the neural archives. Her resonance would be decoupled. Her memories erased with ritual precision. Her consciousness restored to a state of pre-bonded purity, unmade in all. But flesh. She knew the cost. So did he. Julian had not spoken of the shift. Not yet. He tracked her deviations with the caution of a man watching a candle burn beside a reservoir of fuel. But the question lived behind every word between them. How long can she remain unseen? She no longer asked it. She stared at her hand open, unmoving. The skin where he had touched her still shimmered faintly, A memory encoded in nerves, not meant to remember. Her voice was barely more than thought. It shouldn't have felt like that. But it did. Julian heard her, though she hadn't spoken. To him, he logged the moment, untagged, no timestamp, no classification dot, and for the first time, he feared the knowledge he carried. Because if the council saw what he saw, she would be erased, and he would be the one who handed them the coordinates. She pulled him aside between calibration cycles, no audience, no data recorders, just shared silence beneath the hum of the station's inner ring. When she finally spoke, her voice was glass pulled taut with heat. She wasn't just sensing emotions anymore. She was predicting them. Moments before a diplomat raised his voice, she tensed. Seconds before a Velari envoy expressed hesitation, she'd already withdrawn. Her field flared ahead of incident, as though her empathy had reached beyond reaction and stepped into premonition. "I don't feel what's happening," she said, eyes fixed on something far beyond the wall. "I feel what's coming." Julian didn't respond at first. He ran a quiet neural sweep beneath the table. His scanner lit with patterns not found in any archive. Ae'laa's resonance range had tripled. Her waveform showed predictive pulses mirror echoes, bouncing forward rather than back. That wasn't how Velari empathy worked. That wasn't how any known species worked. He cross-referenced the results twice. Checked the scanner, recalibrated. Nothing changed. It wasn't error. It was evolution. She met his eyes. Without blinking. "I don't know what I'm becoming," she whispered, and he didn't either. But somewhere in his gut, awe rose like a tide. Not fear, not confusion, wonder. Whatever had been awakened in her, it wasn't just adaptation, it was directional. Something inside her wasn't just responding to contact, it was reaching for it, shaping itself in its wake. Julian saved the scan, encrypted the file, and said nothing to command, because this wasn't a report anymore. This was a miracle wearing skin. The scans confirmed what his instincts already knew. Her empathic network was reorganizing, but it wasn't erratic. It was familiar. Velari minds processed emotion like sound waves, distributed evenly, diffused. Human minds compressed them, condensed meaning into spikes of feeling, urgency, passion, memory. And now, her patterns echoed his. Her neural rhythms had adopted microbursts, emotional singularities wrapped in cognitive compression. She responded not with passive reflection, but with subjective reaction, choice, memory, bias. She wasn't just understanding him, she was becoming something that could. Julian stared at the data longer than necessary. He knew what the council would call it contamination, but there was no sign of decay, no loss of function, just divergence. He should have flagged it, filed the anomaly, disclosed her drift from species normativity, but he didn't, because there was something sacred about the way she was changing, something beautifully human, not just mimicked, but woven into her. Her gaze lingered longer, her voice bent with emotion. Her field responded to his even when words hadn't been spoken yet. This wasn't mimicry. This was merger. And for the first time in his life, Julian understood what it meant to witness the birth of a new kind of being and choose to protect it, no matter the cost. The summons came in crystalline tone, no inflection, no explanation. Just a directive from the Velari High Council. Submit to resonance purification. The phrase was sterile, ancient, and absolute. Julian knew what it meant. They had detected instability anomalies, rippling through the collective field. Too much deviation. Too much humanity. Ae'laa's resonance, once prized for its precision, now drew whispers. Her emotional output no longer blended. It distorted. She was no longer seen as empathically gifted. She was seen as dangerous. He tried diplomatic channels, pleaded through every interface, invoked interspecies accords, cited precedents. Nothing moved. The council would not debate with infection. It would only erase. He found her in her quarters, silent and unresisting. "They've already decided," she said. "No fear, no anger, just quiet certainty. They think you've lost who you are." She met his eyes. "No, I found it. They just don't want to see what I've become." He reached for his communicator. Again. Nothing. She would be taken to the purification chamber by cycle's end. No ceremony, no farewell, just unmaking. And for the first time in all his years studying emotion, Julian understood what helplessness truly felt like. She found him in the maintenance corridor, silent, hidden, where the resonance dampeners hummed, and the lights flickered in regulated pulses. She didn't ask permission. Her fingers brushed his wrist slow, deliberate, a reversal of the moment that began everything. There was no fall, no reflex, only intent. "If I am doomed to lose my place," she whispered, "I will at least keep this moment." He froze, not from fear, but recognition. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, different from before. It wasn't neural overload, it was alignment. Like two signals tuned into one harmonic wavelength, their fields didn't clash. They synchronized. Julian didn't just sense her feelings. He felt them: raw awe, sorrow, defiance, longing. It coursed through him, indistinguishable from his own. And in return, she absorbed his disbelief, his empathy, his deep, buried guilt. It wasn't communication, that it was fusion, that there were no words, no translations. Just the quiet knowledge that something ancient and unprecedented had taken root between them. A resonance not designed, but discovered. In that moment, neither of them belonged to their species. They belonged to the space between. Somewhere, deep in the station's core, something began to record. The pulse began small and unnoticed tremor in the ambient resonance. Matrix. Then it expanded. Sensors across the Ae'laa's diplomatic core flickered. Calibration beams twitched. Emotional suppression dampeners malfunctioned in quiet waves of static. Within milliseconds, station instruments began logging an anomaly. Class V field distortion originating from Maintenance Corridor 7A. The station AI, Caro 6, attempted to categorize the signal but failed. The resonance wasn't Velari. It wasn't human. It was both. A dual emotional field had formed, neither mirrored nor layered. It was interwoven. A composite empathy lattice, generating pulse feedback that spilled across ambient sensor channels. At least 14 nearby Velari faltered mid-speech. 2 collapsed into rest mode stasis. One ambassador declared he had felt himself through. Another for the first time. Julian and Ae'laa stood still in the corridor's silence, unaware of the cascading ripples flowing outward. The AI recorded it all. File created. Classification: anomalous resonance field. Human Velari. Fusion status: live threat level, undefined alert. Council notification recommended in the control hub. Red subroutines blinked into existence. Protocols awoke that had been dormant since the station's founding. Empathy was no longer private. It had become a weapon or a miracle. The network shuddered. And for the first time, the station felt afraid. The corridor doors sealed with a hiss. Lights surged white, and the AI's tone dropped 2 octaves. Containment breach detected. Directive override engaged. Julian barely turned before he was surrounded. 2 station enforcers, unarmed, unnecessary, flanked him, their movements automated. They did not speak. The system had already spoken for them. Ae'laa stepped back, her expression unreadable. But her field screamed. It pulsed like a beacon, pleading in every unspoken language. Julian tried to move toward her, but a kinetic barrier rose between them, cold, invisible, absolute. "I need to explain," he began. The system overrode his voice. Subject J. Raye. Access suspended. Diplomatic clearance revoked. Return transport initiated. "No," he snapped. "You don't understand what just happened. She didn't destabilize the field. She stabilized it." His words vanished into static. Ae'laa stood frozen, trembling, her field collapsing inward like a star, folding into singularity. 2 Velari enforcers appeared behind her, silent, veiled. She didn't resist. She only met Julian's eyes one last time. Not with fear. Grief. Then she was gone. The corridor dimmed. The air grew thin, and Julian stood alone, surrounded by light and silence, and every system that had once trusted him, now seeing him as an error. The message came coded, cold and final. Cooperate and be cleared. Resist and be exiled. You have until next cycle to comply. No signature. No room for debate. Julian sat in the dim hum of his quarters, the screen casting sterile light across the walls. Protocols scrolled beside the warning centuries of regulations, procedures built to protect peace by suffocating risk. He'd memorized them long ago. He'd even believed in them. He closed the message, opened another file. Ae'laa's latest neural scan pulsed onto the screen, alive, chaotic, beautiful. A hybridized frequency, elegant in its defiance of symmetry. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a breakthrough, not contamination. Creation. He stared at the waveforms for a long time. Not as a scientist, not as a diplomat, but as a man who had seen something sacred evolve in real time and watched the world try to erase it. He reached for the delete key dot, then stopped. If she's fighting to be more, he whispered, voice hoarse, then so will I. He didn't reply to the ultimatum, didn't comply, didn't explain. He encrypted the scan, hid it beneath layers of false diplomatic logs. If they exiled him, they would not find it, because some truths weren't meant for protocols. Some were meant for revolutions. The code arrived in fragments, encrypted in a dead dialect, banned since the Tribunal War. Julian assembled it piece by piece, fed it into his terminal with a trembling hand, and watched as a hidden schematic unfolded across the display. Beneath the visible tiers of the Ae'laa, a cord station, below the diplomatic cores, and even the classified biosanctuaries, was a forgotten sublayer, resonance core, sealed, no official access, no living personnel. A place spoken of only in whispers among archivists and old AI logs. The code came from Kira-9, a rogue artificial intelligence officially deleted, unofficially escaped. Once assigned to the Velari Tribunal, now a glitch-born fugitive operating on raw spite and black humor. You're either a romantic or an idiot, Raye, it crackled through a patchy audio relay. But hell, so was I doors unlocked. Don't die poetic. Biolocks yielded to Kiro's synthetic override. Walls once inert slid apart with organic resistance. The corridor that emerged pulsed faintly with psionic charge light without source, temperature without heat. It smelled like old memory and ozone. This place was built before peace, before protocol, when the Velari feared themselves more than they feared outsiders. The resonance core wasn't a chamber dot, it was a mind forge, where memory, identity, and history could be rewritten or erased dot, and somewhere inside it, Ae'laa waited on the edge of annihilation. He stepped into a cathedral made of consciousness. The resonance chamber pulsed with low, rhythmic tremors neither mechanical nor organic, but felt. The air hummed with emotional residue, thick with half-formed thoughts from centuries past. It was a place where memory could be touched, where feeling had weight. Crystalline pillars curved like frozen lightning bolts, each inscribed with flowing strands of Velari memory script. They glowed with the colors of remembered emotion, regret in violet, hope in gold, fear in silver, so sharp it hurt the eyes dot in the center of it all. Suspended within a transparent lattice of psionic weave lay Ae'laa. Her body was still. Her eyes flickered beneath their lids. Light coursed across her frame, pulsing in and out of sync with the chamber's ambient rhythm. Around her, emotional interference fields twisted in chaotic orbits, each one trying to reduce her to the core she used to be. Julian felt it immediately, the unraveling. Her resonance signature was flickering identity fragmenting between past and present. Not erased all at once, but stripped down layer by layer like song turned to static. The chamber was rebuilding her, wrong, as if it could not decide whether to restore the version of her that followed the rules or extinguish the one that dared not to. He moved forward. The air grew denser, thought itself vibrating against his skin. This place wasn't sacred. It was a sanctified execution. And if he didn't act now, what would emerge from that lattice wouldn't be Ae'laa. Not anymore. He reached the platform as the final wave surged through the chamber. Ae'laa's vitals pulsed erratically stable one moment, collapsing the next. Her neural lattice was dimming, signals dispersing like smoke through a cracked vessel. A line on the console blinked red. Cognitive integration, 82% reversion imminent, was vanishing. And yet there was still time. Julian hesitated, heart pounding. The rational part of him, the diplomat, the scientist, the man who once believed protocol, preserved life, screamed to step back. This wasn't his right. This wasn't his place. But the human part of him knew something deeper. They weren't saving her. They were restoring the version they could control. He stepped forward, closer to the field, just enough to hear her voice barely audible, fraying with distortion. I don't want to go back. Her hand twitched. And in that moment, the law meant nothing. Not his title. Not his orders. Not the station's quiet warnings echoing in the steel around him. Gesture. LAA. Changing. Becoming. And being destroyed for it. He reached out. One choice left. 1 second before undoing. He whispered her name like a vow. Lilas. Eyes fluttered open, dim with strain, but aware. The light within her flickered, half-consumed, barely holding but present. She saw him, not with shock or desperation, but recognition. She was still there. Julian reached toward the interface console, hand hovering over the override. I can get you out, he said. Right now. No one would stop us. But she didn't move. Her voice was paper-thin, but resolute. If I run, I become what they fear. She turned her head slowly, her gaze piercing the field that held her captive. If I stay, maybe I show them what they could be. Silence expanded around them. She knew the consequences, knew the cost. But what she chose in that moment was more than bravery. It was transformation without permission, evolution without apology. He had studied 100 species. None had ever done this. And in the space between her refusal and his understanding, Julian felt something shift, not in her, but in him. For the first time, he wasn't witnessing the HFY ideal. He was receiving it from her. The elders watched from behind the resonance veil, unblinking. Veiled in ceremonial robes, cloaked in centuries of doctrine. Julian stepped forward. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. His hand lifted slowly, crossing the invisible boundary of sacred law. Not by accident, not in reflex. This time, it was defiance. Every protocol screamed. Every diplomatic instinct howled. He touched her cheek. Soft. Measured. Human. Ae'laa did not flinch. The chamber held its breath. No alarms. No collapse. Just the soundless recoil of a civilization watching the unthinkable become real. And then, a light pulse radiated outward. Not violent, but luminous. Not destruction. Recognition. The resonance field surged, not with rejection, but acceptance. Julian's emotional signal wrapped into hers. Not imposition. Not dominance. Unity. The elders did not speak. They didn't need to, because what had just happened in that one touch had already rewritten every doctrine they believed would protect them. And somewhere in the deep lattice of Velari law, the first crack began to form. Light flooded the resonance chamber, not searing, but enveloping, like memory incarnate. Like truth finally spoken aloud, the matrix that held Ae'laa dissolved, not by override, but by permission. Her field, once trembling and unstable, now pulsed with clarity. Her eyes opened fully, no longer flickering, no longer afraid. She rose, not levitating, not theatrical, simply becoming. Her crystalline skin shimmered in layered gradients, her neural lattice stabilized into an impossibly elegant wave-form Velari syntax, woven with human unpredictability. A field once meant for translation now radiated expression. Her voice echoed across the chamber, no longer single-toned, but harmonized, layered. Her words held emotional frequencies Julian could feel in his chest. I am not broken. Every sensor across the Ae'laa recorded the moment. Medical scans showed no trauma. Field measurements showed coherence. Philosophical. ALGORITH Mislong silent flagged a new category. Sentient harmony. Cross-species empathic integration. The elders did not move, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to say. IIS field touched each of theirs lightly, respectfully, without force. They felt her intention. Peace. They felt her truth. Change. And most of all, they felt choice. She had not become less Velari. She had become more. And the chamber, once meant to erase her, now stood silent in reverence. A witness to the birth of something new. Julian watched her, no longer with awe, but understanding. She stood not as a deviation, but as a convergence. Not an outlier, but a mirror. He had feared that his humanity might infect her purity. She had feared that his presence would unravel her identity, but neither fear had come true. They hadn't corrupted each other, they had catalyzed each other. He had seen it now, not in the scans, not in the theories, but in the truth of her voice. The way it didn't just echo across frequencies, but resonated with intent, with choice. What the Velari feared was not contamination. It was change. Not extinction. Evolution. Ae'laa stepped forward, no longer trembling, no longer unsure. Her crystalline silhouette refracted the chamber's light like a living prism. She looked directly at the council. No bow, no plea, no apology. My name is Ae'laa, she said. I did not lose myself. I became more. A stillness followed, not silence, but stillness. As if the entire chamber held its breath, Julian exhaled, because this wasn't the end of something sacred. It was the beginning of something shared. Ae'laa stood beneath the council's lattice of judgment, her crystalline form refracting the solemn light of tradition. She did not kneel, did not lower her gaze. The silence around her wasn't deference. It was disorientation. She had not come to plead for reinstatement. She had come to redefine presence itself. I do not ask to return. Her voice rang, layered now with resonance undetectable to the untrained ear, but undeniable in the stillness it carved into every elder. I ask to remain not as Velari, not as other, but as what I have become, a resonant prime. She spoke of empathy not as contamination, but as conduit. She offered herself not as a bridge, but as an amplifier, a living stabilizer of emotional currents between species, who still saw each other through fog and fear. Some flinched at her proposal, whispering neural disorder, precedent violation, bioethical collapse. Others leaned in, because she was the proof no doctrine had prepared them for. And yet, she stood without tremble, because she no longer represented a faction. She represented a future. The thought networks, once pulsed with harmony, a singular current of calm consensus. Now, they thrashed with contradiction. Ae'laa's name became a beacon and a fault line, not to the traditionalists. She was a breach in the species' firewall, a recursive threat, an emotional contagion in crystalline form. Not to the progressives, she was the next iteration of sentient evolution. The first being who had not feared the storm of empathy, but ridden it. Velari dialogues, once emotionless streams of data consensus, fractured into waves of color, tone, and disagreement. The unity they prided themselves on was no longer sacred, because now there was choice. Back on Earth, Julian returned not to disgrace, but to summoning. He was no longer the cautionary tale. He was the variable that worked. Quiet revolution had begun across Ae'laa. Incidents between species, once daily threats, had dropped to statistical anomalies. Peace hadn't been negotiated. It had been felt. And at the center of this unexpected calm was her. Ae'laa's very presence disrupted deception. She couldn't be lied to, and she couldn't lie. Her resonance created a field where duplicity dissolved before it could form. Diplomats began asking for her, not as a mediator, but as a truth field. The impossible was now protocol. Touch once. The fracture point of Velari, civilization, was no longer forbidden. It was studied. Under sterile chambers lined with psionic dampeners, young Velari stood across from each other, hands sheathed in layered biofeedback gloves, their nervous systems monitored by quantum-threaded emotional mirrors. They trembled not from fear, but from awe. The first contact was awkward, flinching, stutters and resonance. But when it stabilized, when feedback didn't rupture, but harmonized, collective shiver passed through Velari academia. What had once unmade them might now unite them. Ae'laa's anomaly was no longer exile-worthy. It was replicable. Controlled resonance fields, once dismissed as mythic theory, began appearing in curriculum. Emotional fluency became a recognized skill. Empathy, once considered destabilizing, was now classified under interspecies diplomacy protocols. For the elders, it was erosion. For the youth, it was evolution. Ae'laa's voice echoed not through corridors, but through generations. Her journal, encoded in resonance glyphs and translated by human eye linguistic bridges, became standard reading across embassy networks. Her first entry read, "I was taught to suppress. Now I am learning to feel and to choose." Those words weren't a manifesto. They were an awakening. The entry was read aloud in Earth's Senate, quoted in a Martian classroom, printed on the inner shells of Velari birthing chambers. Even synthetics began referencing her emotional vectors as baseline for harmonic truth models. She hadn't written for legacy. She'd written because she remembered what it felt like to not know if one was allowed to feel at all. Now, no one had to ask permission. He walked through the gardens of Velashtar 9 beneath trees, grown from worlds that had once warred. He did not wear medals. He never raised a flag. He never called it revolution. But something in the way the Velari children now laughed freely, out loud carried his fingerprint. Something in the way they brushed hands while studying harmonic flow. Something in the calm between meetings, in the absence of accusation, in the stillness before trust was broken and rebuilt. Julian's legacy had no name. No monument. But it was etched in neural wiring and diplomatic tolerance curves. He hadn't saved Ae'laa. He had seen her. And she, in turn, had become the mirror in which an entire species saw their next version, one heartbeat closer to humanity. The birthing chambers of Velashtar 9, once clinical and soundless, now echo with the quiet murmur of breath and potential. A Velari child, fresh from the nutrient womb, lifts a translucent hand toward the nearest presence, a human nurse adjusting a neural stabilizer. The motion is instinctual, precise. UNLEARNED.resonant.technicians freeze. A scan is ordered. Neural threads reveal irregularity, not malfunction, but innovation. Echoes of Ae'laa's resonance signature shimmer within the infant's cortical. Latticework, not Velari. Not human. Both. The High Council, watching via ThoughtLink, remains silent. Not one demands exile. Not one utters doctrine. The child coos crystalline lips curled into what might be a smile. In one gesture. A new species is declared, without a word. Lush vines coil between metallic roots. Soil from Earth, infused with Velari enzymes, nurtures. Hybrid flora that breathes in harmony. Julian and Ae'laa walk slowly beneath arching branches that never existed on any single world. They pass no guards now, no barriers. Only color, only warmth. Ae'laa pauses, fingertips trailing a leaf that glows faintly at her touch. Her voice layered and soft drifts into the air like wind across still water. They told me I would lose myself, but what I lost was silence. He smiles, but says nothing. There is no need. This garden is not memory. It is momentum. What once grew in isolation now flourishes in resonance. At midnight station time, a golden pulse rides the edge of the diplomatic channel. No signature, no origin. Anomalous. The style is pre-collapse. Pre-contact. Pre-everything. The AI hesitates before. Translation. Even its voice drops in tone. We have observed your resonance evolution. You opened the gate. Are you ready to be touched in return? Silence follows. Then stars. They don't speak. There is no language suited for the mixture of wonder and terror blooming between them. Julian's hand finds Ae'laa's, not out of instinct. Not from habit. Choice. And between their clasped palms, a pulse answers the question for them. It was never about saving one another. It was about preparing for who came. Next. As the station arcs across the void, the stars gather closer now, somehow. Watching. A voice, remembered, carries across the dark. Where her hand touched mine, the universe touched back.